What's up, Koinonia and families? We are super excited to be going through the book of James together. We're going to be releasing a new chapter every other day or so, and we would love for you to watch these devotionals in the context of the full playlist that we'll put together. That way we'll be able to worship together, understand scripture together, and also hear from some outside voices and other opinions and thoughts on what the book of James is teaching us. But without going any further, let's jump right into it. Enjoy. Welcome back. We're glad you're here. If you have not yet read through James chapter 3 recently, go ahead and pause the video now, and why don't you take a few moments to do that. Otherwise, let's jump into it. James chapter 3, and throughout this chapter we see he brings a couple of these major themes back up that we've been talking about. And let's start not from the beginning, but I actually want to start us off at the end of the chapter, at verse 13 and following. And as we kind of read through that section, we see that James is talking about this false wisdom versus a true wisdom, different types of wisdom that we might encounter in our lives. And the false wisdom he describes as boastful or envious, basically things that are self-promoting or self-serving. And the decisions that we make as we're thinking about, well, what does that look like in our lives? The decisions we make out of a false wisdom are decisions that put ourselves above those around us, that put ourselves and people that are like us even above the people around us. And so it's self-serving. But then he contrasts that with this real wisdom. And this real wisdom is of God, and you can kind of get that sense as he's describing it, because he says it's humble, it's merciful, and it's actually, he says, it's shown by our good life, right? And so what he's saying is this wisdom that comes from God that allows us to make healthy decisions and decisions that bring us closer to him and closer to others, we can show that and we can learn that by practicing it. And so he's saying the more that we're practicing making wise decisions, God starts to grow true wisdom in us. Let's take a thought for a second about what that might look like. The more decisions we're faced with, if we are able to make our decisions using wise wisdom time and time again, the more that becomes muscle memory in our lives, right? And the more that becomes muscle memory in our lives, sooner it becomes natural for us to act that way. And so what James is saying here is that when we are trying to be wise people, we're trying to understand God's wisdom and how that can work in our lives, the more that we practice making good decisions for out of humility and out of mercy, as opposed to decisions that are trying to serve ourselves, the more we do that, we can start to make that natural in our lives and experience God's transformation in us that way. So really, really cool stuff. And he actually, the beginning part of the chapter that we'll talk about now, he's talking about one practical way that we can start to do that. One practical way that we can start to take steps towards practicing that humble wisdom. And he points directly to our mouths. He says our tongues are so important for the life of the believer. We want to be making sure that we're taming our tongue. And so he gives us this analogy of a ship, right? I want you to think of the biggest cruise ship in the world. It's called the Symphony on the Seas, and it's massive. If you took it out of the water and put it on its end and sat it on the ground, it would be almost as tall as the John Hancock Center in Chicago. It's massive. But the truth about that ship is, as it's going through the water, just this massive thing holding 6,000 people in it, it's being steered, it's being set on course by a tiny rudder. That's only like 2% of the entire size of the ship. And so you think about it, this thing that's the size of the World Trade or the John Hancock Center is being steered by something that's just the size of 3 or 4 cars stacked on top of each other. It's crazy. He gives us another example of forest fires, and we recently in our world have seen bushfires in Australia, forest fires in California that just take over everything. They're overpowering and they're so hard to get control of. And so often they start with a tiny spark. That's it. this tiny thing can set off a chain of something massive. This tiny rudder can steer such a massive thing. And the problem is, and how that relates to our tongues, is that because it's just such a small part of our life, we don't focus on our words. But the truth is, the words that we share, the words that we have for other people, set the focus of our life. When we are falling into destruction and saying destructive things to other people, we start to steer ourselves down a similar route. But at the same time, James is saying, yeah, it's a small part of our life, and so it's actually easy to start to use our tongues to steer us the correct direction. So when we are focusing on our tongues, when we are focusing on the things that we're saying, the words that we're using, the way that we're communicating and thinking about other people, it's easy to start to share uplifting and encouraging words, which helps us to practice that wisdom, right? We see it all coming together now. The more that we can steer our tongues in the right direction and steer our lives in that direction, we're practicing out of that real wisdom, being humble, merciful, graceful around other people. You see, when we walk in step with Jesus, and that's what that practice of taming our tongues and learning out of wisdom is. When we're walking in step with Jesus, he gives us his wisdom, he gives us his power, he gives us his wholeness. And that's what this book of James is helping us to understand, that the way that we live our lives in step with Jesus, the actions that we take, play a major part in how we experience our faith, and a major part in how we grow closer with Jesus. So take a few seconds after this video ends. You're going to see some questions on the screen. Pause the video for a second before the playlist moves to the next one, and take a sec to process through those and think about them, reflect on them, discuss with them if you're with your family or a group of friends right now. But spend some time thinking about those questions in light of what we've learned today on James 3. Enjoy.